What is up, fans? Back at it again with the Christopher Gilmore podcast. My name is Blue Banana, and I'm going to be starting us up today with Chapter 4. Okay. Sandra, of course, wanted to ride in the car with Grandma and Grandpa. So, as their car followed Anton's along small country roads to a restaurant he had heard of, he could have talked undisturbed with Saskia about what had happened. Yet he sat behind the wheel in silence. Saskia, who had been brought up not to ask questions when people who had been through the war turned up, inquired only whether it had been some sort of reconciliation scene. Something like that, he answered, even though it wasn't really true. He kept his eyes on the road, feeling as if he had soaked too long in a hot bath. He tried to go over his conversation with Take's, but he was not quite ready for it yet. As if so far there were nothing to think about. He remembered the piece of paper that Take's had slipped into his pocket. Pulling it out, he unfolded it with the fingers of one hand and saw a scribbled address and telephone number. "Are you going to look him up?" asked Saskia. He put it back in his pocket and smoothed his hair to the side. "I don't think so," he said. "But you're not throwing it away." He smiled at her. "True, I'm not." About 10 minutes later, they reached the restaurant, a converted, steep-roofed farmhouse of a solidly provincial pretentiousness. Inside it was dark and empty. Meals were being served in the shaded orchard by waiters in tailcoats. "I want French fries," Sandra cried as she came running from the other car. "French fries," repeated Miss de Graaf, and once more she pretended to gag. "I find that vulgar." And to Saskia, Can't you teach the child to call them pommes frites?" "Let the poor kid eat French fries," said de Graaf, "if she doesn't like pommes frites." "I want French fries." "You'll get your French fries," de Graaf said, covering her head with his hand as if it were a helmet. "With scrambled eggs, or do you prefer with brouillés?" "No, scrambled eggs." "Come on, Dad," said Saskia. "That'll do." De Graaf seated himself at the head of the table and again clasped its edge with outstretched arms. When the waiter handed him the menu, he pushed it aside with the back of his hand. "Fish for the man, French fries and scrambled eggs for the young lady, and some chablis in an ice cooler frosted on the outside. When I look at you in your hot uniform, I'll enjoy my wine all the more." Waiting till his wife suppressed a giggle, he draped the napkin over his lap. "You know the anecdote about Dickens, don't you? Every Christmas Eve, he gave a party for his friends. The fire was lit, the candles burning, and as they sat around their roast goose, they would hear outside the window in the snow a lonely wanderer stamping his feet and waving his arms to keep warm. Every now and then the poor man would exclaim, 'Ho hum hum, what bitter cold!' He was, of course, hired for the purpose to emphasize the contrast." He laughed at Anton, who sat across from him. His cheerfulness was evidently meant to be of help, but his laughter faded when he saw the look in Anton's eyes. He put the napkin down next to his plate, beckoned with his head, and stood up. Anton followed him. Sandra also rose, but Miss de Graaf said, Stay here." The two men came to a stop by the side of a ditch full of duckweed that separated the yard from the meadow. "How are things, Anton?" "It'll be all right, Father." "That damn fool, Gis. What a first-class blunderer. During the war, he was tortured and never said a word, and now he's shooting his mouth off all over the place. How in heaven's name did you end up next to him at the table?" "In a way, it was the second time our paths crossed," said Anton. De Graaf looked puzzled. "Yes, I suppose so," he said when he understood. "But that's why it fits. I mean, it completes the picture." "It completes the picture," de Graaf repeated, nodding. Well, you speak in riddles, but I suppose that's your way of getting it off your chest." Anton laughed. "I don't quite know myself what I mean." "Yes, but then who's supposed to understand?" "Never mind. The important thing is to keep it under control. Perhaps it was a lucky thing for you that it happened this afternoon. We've been suppressing it all these years, and now come the problems. I hear it from all sides. 20 years seem to be a kind of incubation period for our disease. All that unrest in Amsterdam must have something to do with it." "I can't say you gave the impression of having any problems." "Yes," said de Graaf, digging with the tip of his shoe at a pebble stuck between the weeds. "Yes." Unable to loosen the stone, he looked up at Anton and nodded. "Let's go back to the table. Don't you think that's best?" After the de Graffs had driven off to Gelderland, Saskia and Anton took turns going to the bathroom and returned in beach clothes. Having completed this metamorphosis, they drove to Wiek aan Zee. At the end of the narrow road through the dunes, where old bunkers, the former Atlantic fortifications, were still scattered here and there, the sea stretched out smooth and tamed as far as the horizon. Since it was an ordinary school day, the beach was occupied mostly by mothers with small children. They walked on bare feet through the hot sand in the brittle, sharp row of shells between the tide mark and the first line of waves. Not till there did it finally cool down. Saskia and Sandra immediately stripped to their bathing suits and ran to the lukewarm tidal pool in front of the first sandbank. Anton tidied their belongings, spread out the towels, tucking a detective story beneath them, folded the clothes, set out a pail and shovel, and put his watch in Saskia's pocketbook. Then he entered the water slowly, walking toward the deep. Beyond the second sandbar, where he no longer touched bottom, the water became really cold. Yet it was a strange, unpleasant cold that seemed to rise out of the still dead deep, penetrating his body without refreshing it. He swam about for a while. Though less than 200 meters offshore, he no longer felt as if he belonged to the land. The coast, dunes, a lighthouse, low buildings with high antennas stretched out in silence to the right and left. A world fundamentally different from the one he was in now. Suddenly he felt tired and alone, and his teeth began to chatter. He swam back as fast as he could, as if to escape a terrible danger that lay beyond the horizon. Gradually the sea grew warmer, and as soon as he touched ground, he waded to the shore. Near Saskia and Sandra, it was as warm as bath water. Here he stretched out on his back on the hard ridges of sand, spread his arms, and gave a deep sigh. "It's cold farther out," he said. Back on the beach, he pulled his towel a few meters higher, up where the white sand was hot. Saskia sat down next to him, and together they watched Sandra, who herself was eyeing a little girl her own age building a sandcastle. After a while, Sandra too began to dig. The other girl pretended not to notice. "How do you feel?" asked Saskia. He put his arm around her shoulders. "Fine. Can't you forget it?" "I have forgotten." He turned over on his stomach. "The sun feels good." He hid his face in the hollow of his arm and closed his eyes. With a chill, he felt a tickle running onto his back and side, and then Saskia's hands oiling him. A little later, lifting his head with a start, he knew that he must have dozed off. He sat up again and watched Saskia on her knees rubbing oil into Sandra, who paid no attention. The sun was at its hottest. A ball was being tossed back and forth in the water, and two boys were playing the guitar under a canvas awning. Tiny children ran in and out of the sea and poured their pails of water into holes in the sand with the unshakable conviction that the water would eventually stay. Anton picked up his book and tried to read, but without sunglasses he was blinded by the glare of the paper, even when it was shaded by his head. Sandra began to whine, and Saskia took her back into the water. When they emerged, they walked, dripping to a crowd that had gathered farther down, but a minute later, Sandra came running in tears to Anton. "Boys over there," she told him, were hacking with shovels at a purple jellyfish as big as a pancake, and the jellyfish was unable to fight back. With a determination like her mother's, Saskia began to gather her possessions. "I'm going shopping with Sandra in the village, and after that we'll go home. She's dead tired. First the church, then the burial, and then the visit to the widow's house." Crouching, she rubbed Sandra dry till the child stood shaking on her little legs. "Let me come along then." "No, please, stay here. Otherwise it'll just take longer. We'll drink something and then come back to fetch you." He followed them with his eyes in order to wave at them once more, but they trudged up the beach without turning back. When they had disappeared, he lay down on his back, glistening with sweat, and closed his eyes. Gradually, the sounds of the beach withdrew to the outer rim of a bowl as wide as heaven. He himself was floating like a dot at its center, in an empty rose-colored space that was rapidly receding from the world. Something was beginning to pulse underground somewhere, and yet there was no ground. Space itself was pulsing, thumping. It grew darker and cloudy, as when a drop of ink falls into a glass of water. A gradual mingling which will not blend, a spreading like plasma, a transformation, so that a vague hand turns into an old-fashioned professor's face with a goatee and a monocle, and then into a harnessed circus elephant riding a flatbed. The thumping becomes that of a train in a railroad station full of switches. The train vanishes in waves of music, rippling the wheat. All grows darker as night dribbles down. Above the feathered helmet of a suit of armor, a flame still flickers. Then everything grows hard, indestructible, and the light returns. Guys, make note of this. Oh shit, I lost my place. And the light returns, a giant rose-colored crystal door, not lit up by the light, but the source of it. Above it, 2 angels with garlands of lobbed leaves, also made of crystal. The door has been locked with a built-in or melted-in iron bars, painted pink. Nothing has changed in all these years, he notices. He is home again and carefree. Though the doors are barred, he enters, but the rooms are empty. Everything has been transformed. There are multitudes of statues, sculptures, ornaments. It is silent, as in the depths of the sea. He wades through the rooms, which have grown into vast halls, with difficulty, as if he is being held back by something. With a flash of recognition, he comes upon his father's small study at the back of the house. But where the slanting wall used to be, there is now a glass addition, like a large hothouse or winter garden, and inside it is a little fountain and the elegant chalk-white facade of a Greek temple. Alone, he lay on the sofa in his underwear, the doors of the balcony wide open to the summer evening. The room was lit only by the late twilight and the street lamps. Only now did the deep sunburn on his face and the front of his legs begin to show. It was unusual for his slightly olive complexion to burn at all, but he was as red as if he'd had a terrible beating. When Sandra had shaken him awake at the beach, he had been asleep for more than an hour. In sleep, the blood circulates more slowly, whereas in the sun, it is supposed to move faster to counteract the heat, and so sleepers get sunburned. He had awakened with a splitting headache, but in the back of the car, in the soothing shade, it had almost disappeared. No doubt the wine at lunch had something to do with it. The continuous murmur of traffic sounded in the distance, but from the street itself came only the voices of some people sitting on a balcony or downstairs on the stoop. A child was playing the recorder a few houses away. Because Sandra couldn't get to sleep, Saskia put her down on their double bed after dinner and lay down next to her. Then Saskia too immediately fell asleep. Stretched on the sofa, Anton stared straight ahead. He was thinking of Takes, of how everything comes to light sooner or later, and is dealt with and then laid aside. How long ago was it that he visited the Bumers? Some 15 years, more than the age he had been in 1945. No doubt, Mr. Boomer now lay in his coffin, and Miss Boomer as well. He hadn't been to Harlem since, and Fake, God knows where he was. It didn't matter. Perhaps he was running the business in Den Helder by now. But with Takes, it was different. They had wept together. It was the first time that he had cried over what had happened. Yet it wasn't because of his parents or Peter, but because a girl had died. He had never seen. Truce? Truce what? He raised himself and tried to think of her last name, but couldn't. Shot in the dunes, blood on the sand. He closed his eyes to recall the darkness of the cell, her fingers softly caressing his face. He covered his face with his hands and peered wide-eyed through the bars of his fingers. He breathed deeply and brushed his hair back with both hands. He shouldn't be doing this. It was dangerous. There was something wrong with him. He should go to bed. But he crossed his arms and went on staring straight ahead. Takes had a picture of her. Should Anton go to him and identify her? She had been Takes' girlfriend, his great love, apparently, and obviously he had the right to a last message from her. Anton couldn't remember anything she had said, only that she had talked a lot and touched his face. All he would accomplish by going would be to eradicate that great anonymous presence and reduce her to a particular face. Was that what he wanted? Wouldn't it diminish what she still meant to him? It didn't matter whether her face would be beautiful or ugly, attractive or unattractive, or whatever. But if he saw her picture, it would acquire one definite aspect and no other. Now he had no image of her at all, only an abstract awareness, such as Catholic children have of their guardian angel. And then what happened was this. Moving the way a weightless trapeze artist rises from the safety net into which he has fallen, he rose from his prone position onto his knees. There he confronted the photograph he had been staring at all this time without realizing it. It stood, framed together, with his collaboration of sextants on the mahogany cabinet decorated with brass. In the deep twilight, it was difficult to make the picture out, but he knew it well. Saskia in a black dress down to her ankles, her belly big with Sandra, who would be born a few days later. It was not true that he had never imagined what the woman whose name seemed to be Truce looked like. From the very beginning, he had imagined her looking like this and not otherwise. Like Saskia, this was what he had recognized in Saskia at first sight that afternoon at the Stone of Scone. She was the embodiment of an image he must have been carrying about in his head. Without knowing it, since he was 12, her appearance revealed it to him, not as something remembered, but as immediate love, immediate certainty that she must remain with him and carry his child. Worried, he began to pace the room. What kind of thoughts were these? Perhaps it was true, perhaps not. But if it should be true, wasn't he doing something peculiar to Saskia? She was, after all, someone in her own right. What was her connection with a girl from the resistance who had been shot long ago? If she was not allowed to be herself but represented someone else, then wasn't he in the process of breaking up his marriage? She would never have a chance, for she couldn't be someone else in a sense. He was involved in murdering her. On the other hand, if this were the truth, he wouldn't be married to Saskia now if he hadn't met the girl under the police headquarters. Then the two women had become indistinguishable. That is to say, his imagination was still busy combining them. For probably Saskia didn't look like Truce, since he had no idea what Truce looked like. Besides, Sakes would have reacted differently to Saskia, and he had paid hardly any attention to her. Saskia only looked like the image which Truce had aroused in his. Anton's imagination, but where did this image come from? Perhaps it originated with a much more ancient source. Perhaps it came in the manner of Froude, from the image he had of his mother while he was still in the cradle. He stood on the balcony and looked out unseeing. Whenever he was told in the hospital that a new colleague with such and such a name would be arriving the following day, he would begin immediately to visualize that person. The imagined image never agreed with the person's actual appearance. Was forgotten the moment of meeting, but where did these notions come from? The same was true with famous authors and artists. When he saw their photographs for the first time, he was often terribly surprised. Without being aware of it, he had a preconceived notion of their appearance. Sometimes he lost all interest in the person's work after seeing the photograph. This was the case with Joyce, for instance, and not because he was ugly. Sartre was much uglier, but his portrait had increased Anton's interest. Apparently, the preconceived notion was sometimes more accurate than the reality. In other words, there was nothing wrong with Saskia looking like his idea of Truce. Truce had, under those circumstances, around an image in his mind to which Saskia seemed to respond, and where it came from was unimportant. Besides, maybe the whole thing really worked in reverse. Saskia had touched his heart at first glance, and perhaps this was why he had decided that Truce must have looked the same way. But in that case, he was being unfair to Truce, and thus it was his duty to know not only her name, but also what she actually looked like. She, Truce Coaster. It was cooling off. Police sirens sounded in the distance. Something was happening again in the city, as things had been happening for almost a year now. It was 10:30, and he decided to call Takes at once. He went upstairs to the bedroom. Here, too, the curtain was still open. The blankets were thrown back, and Sandra lay sleeping under the sheet with her mouth wide open. Saskia, half undressed, lay on her stomach, one arm around the child. He stood watching them for a moment in the warm silence filled with sleep. He had the feeling of having just skirted something fatal, something that now seemed to him a dangerous confusion, dizzying cerebral cobwebs caused by sunstroke. He must forget them and go to sleep. Instead, he went to look for his jacket, which Saskia had thrown over a chair With a vague sense that he was still courting danger, he used 2 fingers to fish the slip of paper out of his breast pocket. Okay, thank you.
"Anytime," Takis said. "Why not come right now?" When Anton excused himself because he had a slight headache, Takis answered, "Who doesn't?" The next day, Anton would be on duty till 4, so they made a date for 4:30. The heat continued. He had trouble concentrating on his work. When it was over, he was glad to get outside and walk to the Nieuwjid Voorburg wall. The sunburn on his face and chest was still painful. While Sasika had been thoroughly oiling him up once more that morning, he had wondered whether to tell her about his appointment, but decided against it. On the spui stood a detachment of blue police squad cars. Tension hung about the city, but it had become routine. The mayor and the minister would take care of it. Takis lived behind the royal palace on the dam, in a shabby, narrow house that he could reach only by slipping between delivery trucks. The house dated from more prosperous times. On its gable was a stone relief representing a kind of mythical beast with a fish in its mouth. The inscription underneath said "The Otter." On the front stoop, it took a while before Anton found the right name among all of the different offices and private apartments. Takis was penciled on a scrap of paper thumbtacked under a bell, along with instructions to ring 3 times. When Takis opened the door, Anton saw at once that he had been drinking. His eyes were watery and his face blotchier than the day before. He was unshaven. A grayish film covered his jaw and neck down to his open shirt. Anton followed him through a narrow hall with peeling plaster, parked bicycles, boxes, pails, and a half-deflated rubber boat. Behind closed door, the clatter of typewriters and a radio. An ancient, winding oak staircase came down at an angle into the hall. Sitting on one of the steps, an old man wearing a pajama top over his pants was dismantling a bike pedal. "Did you read the papers?" asked Takis without looking back. "Not yet." In the back of the house, through a door at the end of the hall, Takis entered a small room that served as a bedroom, study, and kitchen. It contained an unmade bed, as well as something like a desk covered with letters, bank statements, newspapers, and magazines. Jumbled among the papers were a coffee cup, an overflowing ashtray, an open jam pot, and even a shoe. Anton could not bear the confusion of unassorted objects. At home, he was unhappy if Sasika left a comb or a glove lying on his desk for a minute. The room was littered with pots, pans, unwashed dishes, even suitcases, as if Takis were on the verge of leaving. Above the sink, an open window overlooked an untidy yard, where more music was playing. Takis took up a newspaper that was spread out on the bed and folded it over and over until nothing was visible except the front page article. "This will interest you too," he said, and Anton saw the headline. "Willy Lages, seriously ill, released." He knew this much, that Lages has been the head of the Gestapo in the Netherlands, and as such was responsible for the thousands of execution and the deportation of 100,000 Jews. After the war, he was condemned to death, but the sentence has been commuted to imprisonment a few years later. There had not been mass demonstrations in which Anton had not taken part. "What do you think of that?" asked Takis. "Because he's sick, our dear little Willy. You'll see how soon he recovers back in Germany, and yet he made a lot of other people really sick, but that's not so important. All those humane do-gooders with their respect for human lives at our expense. The war criminal is sick. Oh dear, the poor lamb. Free the fascists quickly. For we're no fascists, our hands are clean. Does this make his victims ill? What a hateful lot. Those anti-fascists, there's no better themselves. That's what they'll say next, you see. And who's to be the first to approve of this release? All those who kept their hands clean during the war. Catholics in the lead, of course. It's not for nothing that he converted to Catholicism the minute he went to prison. But if he gets to heaven, then I prefer hell." Takis looked at Anton and took the paper out of his hands. "You're just resigned to it, aren't you? I assume that you're blushing with shame. Your parents and your brother also came under the jurisdiction of that gentleman. Not the wreck he is now. That wreck?" Takis took a cigarette out of his mouth, and leaving it open, slowly exhaled the smoke. "Just hand him to me and I'll slit his throat with a pocket knife if necessary. The wreck. As if it were a question of his physique." He threw the newspaper on the bed, kicked an empty bottle under the bed, and looked up with a forced laugh. "But your profession is to rescue ailing mankind, right?" "How did you know?" Anton asked, surprised. "Because I called up your scoundrel of a father-in-law, and a man who should know who he's dealing with. Don't you agree?" Anton nodded, keeping an eye on him, and a smile crept over his face. "The war is still on, right, Takis?" "Sure," said Takis, and did not evade his eyes. "Sure." Anton felt ill at ease under the scrutiny of that left eye. Were they playing a game, waiting to see who would be the first to blink? He lowered his eyes. And you? He asked, looking about. I've been foolish enough not to call anyone. How do you earn a living? In me, you see a distinguished mathematician. Anton burst out laughing. You've got a pretty messy office for a mathematician. That mess came with the war, since I survived thanks to a pension from the Foundation 1940-45. It was founded by Mr. Hitler, who rescued me from mathematics. Without him, I'd still be facing the classroom every day. He took a bottle of whiskey from the windowsill and poured some for Anton. Let's drink to compassion for Pitiless, and he said, and he raised a glass. Cheer. Anton knew the lukewarm whiskey would not agree with him, but refusing it was out of the question. Takis was more cynical than yesterday, perhaps because of the newspaper article or the drinking, or maybe he had simply decided to get into this mood. He didn't offer a seat, and for some reason, this pleased Anton. Why should people always have to sit? After all, Klemenkow had even himself buried on his feet. They stood facing each other in the small room, glasses in hand, as at a cocktail party. As a matter of fact, I, too, worked in the medical line, says Takis. Really? So we're colleagues? You might call it that. Tell me, said Anton, apprehensive. Well, let's just say it was some sort of anatomical institute somewhere in Holland. The director had put it at our disposal to further the good cause. People were tried there, death penalties were pronounced, and so on. They were executed, too. That's little known. Shouldn't be. You never know when you'll need it again. It was mostly for people within the resistance, traitors in our ranks, infiltrators, that sort. Downstairs in the cellar, they were given a phenol injection straight into the heart, with a long needle. Afterwards, they were cut into slices on a granite counter by other white-clad heroes. Ears, hands, noses, penises, and intestines floated in a large basin filled with formaldehyde. It would have been very hard to piece them together again. And for all benefit of science, you understand. He faced Anton defiantly. You see, I'm a worthless son of a bitch. So long as it's for a good cause, said Anton. The crowds were scared of that institute. They did their best to avoid it. They thought it was pretty spooky. But not you. Downstairs there were rows of steel cabinets with drawers. About 5 drawers each, and in every one a corpse. I spent a night in there once, when I had to disappear for a while. And, did you sleep well? Like a log. May I ask you something, Takis? Go ahead, laddie, said Takis, smiling sweetly. What exactly are you doing this for? Do you think I have to be initiated or something? That's not really necessary. I've had my share, and no one knows it better than you. Takis kept his eyes on him and took another sip. I want you to be aware of the man you're dealing with, too. His eyes still on Anton. He took the bottle. Come leave the door open for the telephone. Anton followed him to the basement, where there was another hall. With a key, Takis unlocked a door that opened into a low room whose function was unclear. It was stuffy. The dim light entering through the basement windows was supplemented by the cold glare of fluorescent tubes that flickered feebly with the purplish flashes. The chipped white tiles against the walls suggested that this used to be a kitchen of a private home. Along the low ceiling ran all kinds of pipes and heating ducts. A low table with another well-fitted ashtray stood in the middle of the room, and against the long wall, a worn-out red velvet sofa. There was also an old-fashioned linen closet with a mirror on its door and the wreck of a bicycle. The whole had the air of a bunker, an underground headquarters, especially with the torn, yellowed map taped to the wall across the sofa. Glass in hand, Anton went towards it. Topography of Germany was written on the lower right-hand corner. The map was covered with red and blue lines like tidal waves, showing offensive advances from Russia and France toward Berlin, where they met. The only uncolored areas were North and Central Germany and the western part of the Netherlands. His attention was caught by something floating over a faded blue part of the sea, a faint, pale pink outline of a mouth, a kiss printed on the paper with lipstick. He turned around. Takis, sitting cross-legged on the sofa, was watching him. So that's how it is, Takis said. Was this the reason why the map was hanging here? Not because of an insidious nostalgia for the war, but because her mouth was imprinted on it? Was the basement a memorial? But perhaps she and the war had become one for Takis. Perhaps the war had become his beloved, and for that reason he could not be unfaithful to her. Perhaps even as he was talking of his atrocities, he was really trying to remember Charles Coster in those days that he had been happy. Involuntarily, though there was enough room to stand upright, Anton lowered his head. He sat down next to Takis and looked again at at the mouth rising from the North Sea. It was as if the rest of her face were underwater. As a boy, he used to imagine that if he looked up at a map of Holland under a microscope, he would be able to see the people of Haarlem walking around on the street, and even to see himself leaning over the microscope, if he were doing it outside in the garden. The fair Ophelia. Her lips had touched that spot on the map, perhaps while she and Takis were filling in the lines showing the fronts with help of the news from the Radio London. And while they were making plans about what they would do after the liberation, he heard Takis clearing his throat. But Takis poured himself another drink, a cigarette hanging from his lips, and remained silent. Anton had never felt so involved with another man, and maybe the same was true of Takis. From outside came a gentle tune of Carlion. Anton looked at the bicycle, a man's model with a crossbar and the kind of seat you don't see nowadays. It used to be called a Terry saddle. Then he saw the photograph. It was shaped like a postcard and stuck behind an electronic cable not far from the map. His heart began to pound. Motionless, he stared at the face looking at him across a span of 20 years. While he glanced at Takis, who was watching the smoke rising from his mouth. Then he stood up and walked towards it. Saska. It was Sasika looking at him. Of course, it wasn't Sasika. It didn't even look like her, but the expression in the eyes was Sasika's. Just as it had struck him for the first time in Westminster Abbey. A not usual, friendly girl of 23. The smile drew her mouth a bit to the right of her face, giving it a certain sophistication. It contrasted with her prim, high-collared dress that had a little embroidered detail in the front and the hint of a puffed sleeve. She had thick, wavy hair down to her shoulders, probably light brown hair, but no one can tell from the black and white print. The edges were overexposed, so that rebellious streaks of light curls had flashed over her head against the dark background. Now Takis was standing next to him. Is it her? It must be, said Anton, without taking his eyes off of it. Finally, she had risen out of the darkness, with Sasika's eyes. He remembered his worries of the night before, but was too excited to realize what this likeliness meant. Besides, Takis didn't let him. As if he had controlled himself desperately till now, he seized Anton by the shoulders and shook him the way a teacher might do to a child who had fallen asleep. Tell me, what else did she say? I can't remember. She didn't mention me? I don't remember, Takis. Well, try to, for Christ's sake. Shouting gave Takis a coughing fit that sent him to the corner of the room, bent over, almost throwing up. He stood supporting himself with a hand on his knees. When he straightened up, breathless, Anton said, It's all gone, Takis. I wish I could tell you, but the only thing I remember is that she touched my face. Later, there was blood on it, and that's how I knew she had been wounded. Don't forget that I was only 12. I can't remember my own father's voice. Our house had just been set on fire. My parents, my brother had disappeared. I was in shock. I was hungry, sitting in the dark cell under a police station. A police station? Takis stared at him open-mouthed. Which police station? In Hempstead. Takis made a desperate move with his arm. So that's where she was. Jesus. We could have gotten her out of there. I thought it was in Haarlem. At that very moment, Anton could tell. A plan was forming in Takis' head to infiltrate police quarters in Hempstead. He turned away and paced angrily up and down. The memory of the conversation had disappeared, permanently vanished into the world. He knew that experiments with LSD were going on at the university. It was stored somewhere in his brain, of course. Serious candidates for the experiments were welcome, and the drug might make its comeback. If Takis knew, he might be crazy enough to insist that Anton go through with the experiment. But Anton had no desire to. He did not want his past chemically resurrected. Besides, there was a risk that none of these memories would be revealed, that totally different, unexpected ones would emerge instead, and that he would not be able to control them. All I remember, he said, is that she told me a long story about something. About what? I can't remember. Jesus Christ. Takis emptied his glass and slid it across the table like a bartender in a Western movie. I can't remember. Anton remained standing. What you'd like best, he said, would be to tie me in a chair, aim a lamp at my face, and then try to pull it out of me, right? Takis looked down at his feet. Okay, he said. There was no need for Anton to gaze at the photograph any longer to know what Truist Costa had looked like. Her face was indelibly printed in his memory. Were you married? He asked. Takis poured himself another and handed the bottle to Anton. I was married, all right, but not to her. I had a wife and 2 children. about the same age you were. A bit younger, maybe, but she was the one I loved. Though she didn't love me. I would have left my family just like that for her, but she only laughed when I suggested it. Whenever I said I loved her, she thought I was just being silly. That was only because we'd gone through so much together. Anyway, I'm divorced now. He began to pace the floor. The seat of his pants hung way below his crotch. The backs of his legs were frayed, and Anton thought, here's all that's left of the resistance, a sloppy, unhappy drunk in a basement that he probably never leaves except to bury his friends, while war criminals are being freed and history ignores him. A long story, said Takis. She was good at that. Long stories. All that talk. We'd sit chewing the fat for hours, always about morality. Also, sometimes about what it would be like after the war. But then she wouldn't say much. Once she told me that when she thought about the war, it seemed as if she were looking into a deep hole. But when we discussed morality, she was in her element. Once I asked her, if a Nazi says he'll shoot either your mother or your father, and that you had to choose one, or he'll shoot both, what would you do? I had heard of such a case, Takis said, and threw his button in the ashtray. She asked me what I would do. I said I'd count the buttons on my uniform. Father, mother, father, mother. The only way to counter inhumanity is with idiocy. But she said that she wouldn't tell him anything. Anyone suggesting such a compromise wouldn't keep his word anyway, she thought. Then possibly he might not shoot them. But if you said, my father, maybe he would shoot your face, and then tell you that it had been your choice. And according to her, that would have been true in a way. It was clever of her. It was first rate. Nights on end, we'd sit and talk about our work. Just imagine us sitting there, both of us condemned to death. Had you been condemned to death? Asked Anton. Takis laughed. Of course, aren't you? Once. He continued. She had to go home in the middle of the night, long after curfew. She got lost in the dark and sat down in the street somewhere till dawn. Anton leaned his head back, as if he could hear a sound remembered from somewhere, a faint signal that instantly died. Till dawn? Somewhere in a street? It's as if I had dreamed something like that once. She was completely disoriented, even if you must remember how dark it got in those days. Yes, said Anton. It made me want to become an astronomer. Takis nodded, but hardly seemed to hear. She thought about such things. She was 10 years younger than me, but she thought much more than I did. Compared to her, I was just a peasant, a kind of mathematical idiot. One day, I suggested that we kidnap the children of our dear Reichskommissar Seysencourt, so we could exchange them for several hundred of our own people. But she asked what on earth made me think such a thing. Was I crazy? What did those children have to do with it? True. What did they have to do with it? Nothing at all. Of course, not a thing. Just about as much as the Jewish kids that were being mass murdered, which means nothing at all. But that's just the point. You had to attack your enemy, where he was most vulnerable. And if that meant children, and naturally that's what it meant, then you had to get to them through the children. And what if the deal didn't go through? Then, of course, the children would have to be sacrificed, painlessly, and the Anatomical Institute. He threw a glance at Anton out of the corner of his eyes. Yes, I'm sorry. I'm a worthless son of a bitch. That's the second time you've said so. Is that right? Takis said, acting surprised. Did I really? Well then, let's say I'm not even worthy of a bitch, shall we? So, we didn't go through with it. Fight fascists with fascism is my idea, because I didn't understand any other language. I'd like to use that as my motto, but in Latin, I'm sure you could translate it perfectly, you intellectual. Fascist with fascism, Anton said. You can't put it into Latin. Fasces means a bunch of twigs. A bundle of twigs against a bundle of twigs. It doesn't work. There, you have it, said Takis. Truist didn't think it either. According to her, I had to watch out not to become like them, because that would be their way to get better of me. Yes, she was a philosopher, Steenswick, but still a philosopher with a gun. He walked past the linen closet, leaned over, opened a drawer, pulled out a revolver on the table, and walked on as if nothing had happened. Frightened, Anton gazed at the grayish object that had suddenly appeared. It was so menacing that it seemed likely to sting on the table. He looked up. Is that her gun? That's her gun. Motionless. The thing lay there like a relic from a different civilization unearthed by archaeologists. Did she shoot Plog with it? And hit her target, Takis said, pointing his finger at Anton. Takis stared at the gun for a while. Clearly it brought something else to his mind. I was stupidly preoccupied that night, he said, half to himself. We were riding away next to each other on that quay of yours, hand in hand, very slowly, looking as best as we could, like a pair of lovers. That is, as far as I was concerned, we really were. We let him overtake us, and he called us for a minute. "Good morning to you," Truus called out cheerfully. And he smiled back at us. Then I rode ahead. I had decided to do him in at once, but it was slippery. I had to let go of the handlebar with one hand to pull out the gun from my pocket, and then I skidded. I shot him in the back and a little later in the stomach. But I saw right away that it was no good. As he fell to the ground, I wanted to try once more, but I misfired. I went on fast to make way for Trues. When I looked back, I saw her carefully steadying herself with the tip of her shoe on the sidewalk and aiming precisely between his shoulder blades. He lay completely rolled into a ball, his head hidden between his arms. She shot twice, struck the gun back into her pocket, and quickly rode on. Apparently, she was sure that he was dead, but I saw him raise up myself. I screamed at her to watch out. She accelerated, but then he took a shot at her, and by some idiotic incident hit her, somewhere low on her back. It was as if the gun on the table were a weight that dragged Anton along with it into the depths of the past, just as he had completely forgotten what happened later in the cell, so he clearly remembered the last evening at home, the shots, then the empty quay with Plogue's body. He had known all along, of course, that someone must have been on the quay minutes before the shots sounded, but only in an abstract way, whereas now it became a reality. The screams he hadn't heard had been Plogue's then, but Taka's. He could have sworn it could have been the scream of a dying man. In the ashtray next to the gun, something began to smolder. "And then?" he asked. "And then, said Takis, taking some odd dance steps. "Once upon a time, they lived happily ever after. You're just like a child." And then she was unable to go on. I tried to hoist her onto my baggage rack, and I tried to hide the two of us into the bushes. But when the Germans appeared, a woman called from her window and told them where we were. Trues gave me her gun and a kiss, and that was that. A bit more shooting, and I was off. I tried to find that bitch again before the end of the war, to deal with her on my own terms, but no luck. She's still around somewhere, pretending to be a dear old grandmother. He took the gun from the table and weighed it into his hands, the way an antique dealer would handle a precious jewel. I would have loved to confront her with this. "Good evening, madam. How are all things? All well with the children?" He surrounded the trigger with his finger and examined the weapon from all sides. "It can still be used for shooting, you know that. After the war, your father-in-law and his buddies would have liked me to hand it in. I'm under surveillance these days. You're only allowed to keep it as a souvenir, but then you have to keep it spiked so it can't be used. I decided not to. You can never tell when you're going to need it one last time." He put it down and lifted a finger. "Do you hear? It's crying a little. No mother has ever spoiled her child so much as Truus did this thing here." For a moment, it looked as if tears were going to fill Take's eyes, but it didn't happen. "You know what?" he said, suddenly changing the subject. "I saw a film once about a man whose daughter had been raped and murdered. The culprit is given 18 years, and the father swears he'll murder him the day he gets out. The man is free after about 8 years, a commuted sentence for good behavior. Parole, the lot. The father waits at the gate with a gun in his pocket, and all day long you see them getting along fine and chatting together. He doesn't shoot him in the end because he understands that the other is just another miserable victim of circumstances." Upstairs, the phone was ringing. As Take slowly made his way to the door, he finished the story. "Last shot. The father remains standing while you see the other guy walking away with a suitcase along a path through the forest. Then you see a white speck appear in his back, which moves forward and grows into the letters 'The End.' And at that moment, one thing becomes very clear to me, namely, that the father, in spite of his broad-mindedness, should have pulled out the revolver and shot the other in the back, because his daughter had not been killed on the account of circumstances, but by that particular man. If you don't follow through, then what you're saying is that all of those who have lived under unfortunate conditions are potential rapists and murderers." I'll be back. The basement was silent, but the violence that Takis had invoked hung there like an inaudible echo. The defective fluorescent tubes went on blinking. With his back to the pistol, Anton sat on the edge of the table and looked at the lips hanging over the North Sea. He would have pressed his mouth to them, but he didn't dare. The face on the photograph smiled back at him. Wherever he was, she kept looking at him without moving her eyes. She could look at hundreds of people at once, just as she had when the photograph was taken, and never age, and never see anything herself. And so, with Saska's eyes, she had looked at him that time in the dark, Past him, through him, wounded, having just killed a murderer. She was on the eve of God knows what torture and her execution in the dunes. He laid his hands against his face where she had touched him and closed his eyes. The world is hell, he thought. Hell. Even if we had heaven on earth tomorrow, it couldn't be perfect because of all that happened. Never again could things be set right. Life on this planet was a failure, a big flop. Better than it should have never begun, not until it ended. And with every single memory of all of those death throes, would the world return to order. Suddenly, there was a terrible stench. He opened his eyes. A blue pillar of smoke was rising straight from the ashtray. He dumped his leftover whiskey on the glowing mess, which only made it worse. In the corner, he saw the kitchen faucet over a low, square sink. When he tried to pick it up in the ashtray, he burned his fingers. He looked at the glass to the sink. After letting some water run over his fingers, he filled the glass and emptied it onto the ice tray. The contents turned into a disgusting black brew, and the smoke billowed up to the low ceiling. After he had tried in vain to open the transom window, he left the basement. In the hall, he remembered the gun on the table. Since the key was still in the lock, he turned it and went upstairs. Taka stood in his room, looking out. The receiver was back on the hook. Outside, the siren sounded and the roar of the crowd. "Here's the key," said Anton. "It stinks downstairs. The ashtray caught fire." Takas did not turn to him. "Do you remember the man sitting next to me yesterday in the cafe?" "Of course," said Anton. "It was me." "The other one, on the other side, the one I was talking to?" "Vaguely. He just committed suicide." Anton felt as if he couldn't take much more. "Why?" he whispered, though he did not mean to whisper. "He kept his word," said Takas, not really talking to Anton anymore. When Lage's sentence was commuted in 1952, he predicted, "Now you'll see. They'll let him out too, but if they do, I'll blow my brains out." And we used to laugh at him, saying he'd live as long as the meth law. Anton stared at his back a few minutes longer, then turned to the left of the room. In the hall, the old man wearing the pajama top had disappeared. Behind a door, a smoldering voice on the radio sang, "Red roses for a blue lady."